So let's now have a look at Henri Corbin's unique Christology, which we could, in all fairness, call a more esoteric Christology. Because that will be very helpful to understand some of the texts we have read, especially from the Apocryphal Acts. To begin with, it's important to realize that Corbin, whose primary interest was in Islamic mysticism, all his life remained a Protestant Christian. And his research in Islamic studies enabled him to have a very critical approach towards the traditional church doctrine regarding the nature of Christ, his life, the incarnation, his crucifixion, and subsequent resurrection. So what is unique if you read his work is that it's through the study of the Islamic texts he translated and commented, he came step by step to developing a Christology that for himself was more in harmony also with esoteric Judaism and Islam. And later on, he discovered that some of the ideas he developed could indeed be found within the environment of Christian theosophers like Jacob Böhme, or to a certain extent, also people like Emanuel Swedenborg, about whom he has written, by the way, a very interesting study where he compares Swedenborg with esoteric Islam, especially the Shiite school. But that's a different topic. So to understand Corbin's Christology, as stated, we have to remember, we have to realize his fundamental critique to the, what we could call the Orthodox traditional perspective on Christ. What was his critique? Let's quote him and then comment on what he says. He says, because the historical incarnation of Christ is a unique and reversible fact, something that took place more than 2,000 years ago, a moment in time, it takes its place in a series of material facts. God in person was incarnated at a moment in history. And this then happened within the framework of a set of chronology. So that's the traditional perspective on the incarnation. Christ, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, incarnated at a certain moment and took upon himself human nature. Remember the traditional doctrine, Christ is one divine person with two natures, the divine nature which is innate in his divine personality, and the human nature which he received, of course, through the virgin birth. And what Corbin finds problematic is that the divine manifestation, the way God reveals himself to humanity, is literally physical. It's literally done only via a physical incarnation. And that makes the divine revelation and manifestation to a unique historical event irreplaceable and irreversible. And according to him, by becoming part of a causal chain of history, by becoming part of a historical timeline, the sacred becomes, as it were, secularized, materialistic. The sacred also becomes a public event. The incarnation is a public event with so-called eyewitnesses. And a public event, according to Corbin, then naturally leads to a public authority whose task it is to preserve the historicity of that event. And hence you get a church authority, a magisterium, that guards the objective physical truth of the incarnation. And although he doesn't say it with that many words, such a literal view on the manifestation of Christ on earth also leads to a devaluation of other religions. The uniqueness of Christ's incarnation means in the end the danger, the risk of the uniqueness of Christianity in the sense of its superiority in comparison with Judaism, Islam, or other traditions. And since Corbin's major concern, not only personally, but also as a scholar, was to find a kind of common ground behind the three major monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in his own words, he wanted to come to a kind of harmonia abrahamica, a kind of harmony between the three religions of the book. You can understand that he therefore was very critical to a literal incarnational view on the manifestation of Christ. Subsequently, he says that such an historicization of Christ, that leads to no more mystery. Consequently, esotericism is no longer necessary. And that is why all the resurrected Christ teachings to his disciples have been piously relegated to the Apocrypha. They had no connection to history anymore. That's an interesting statement. Exactly because the dominant form of Christianity stressed the importance of the literal historical incarnation. According to Corbin, it's not a surprise that the writings that circulated in the first centuries of Christianity that were supposedly conveying Christ's teachings after his resurrection, that they did not enter the canonical scriptures, that they did not become part of the New Testament, hence became apocryphic. Because, as you remember, from several of the quotes I've given to you from the Acts of John and the Acts of Peter, the visionary experiences that are there shown to us are clearly not to be understood as historical events, but more as events presented, experienced in the soul of the disciples. So he was looking for an alternative view to approach that mystery of the dual nature of Christ, Christ both being human and divine. And he found that within Islamic esotericism, both in the Shiite and in the Sufi tradition. So by studying the writings of people like Ibn Arabi and Surawardi. And there he came up, he found the idea of what could be called prophetic revelation or theophanical manifestation of the divine. And that idea entails that there is indeed such a notion as God becoming human. But primarily, what he discovered in these esoteric writings he studied, that becoming human of the divine takes place not primarily on earth, but on the level of the soul, on the level of the world of the soul, or what Corbin, as we know, called the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, the world where all mythologies, all sacred events happen and are real. Let's see what he says himself about that. He says, all esotericism in Islam, in Shiism and in Sufism, recognizes a divine anthropomorphosis. So a divine becoming human, a divine manifestation in human form. This anthropomorphosis is essential to the Godhead, but it takes place in heaven on the plane of the angelic universes. So we would say on the level of the mundus imaginalis, in the symbolical world, which is not an unreal world, a fantasy world, not at all. It precedes our world and has its own ontology, and it's in that realm of existence, on that plane to which the soul belongs and the angels belongs, that the unknowable Godhead becomes manifested as an archetypal human being. And that's not so much an anthropomorphization done by humans. We envision God in a human form. No. What these esotericists all try to convey is the opposite, that the unknowable Godhead desires, wants to express himself, itself, in a human form, in a cosmic human form, in a celestial human form, before there is even the possibility of a manifestation of God on earth. He continues, and here you see, by the way, a beautiful calligraphic illustration of the divine manifestation in human form, of the anthropomorphosis of the Godhead. Corbin continues by saying, this celestial anthropos, this celestial man, is therefore not incarnated on earth. He is manifested on earth in theophanic figures, which draw his followers, those who recognize him, toward the celestial assumption. So what is he saying here? What did he discover? That the unknowable Godhead takes a human shape on the level of the soul, and that celestial man, that celestial anthropos, presents itself, manifests itself, indeed, in history, through different human figures, prophets, sages, including, for example, Noah, Moses, and Jesus. And that's something else than a literal incarnation of that divine human, of that celestial anthropos, physically in a human being. And for him, that discovery opened up a new way of looking at the mystery of Christ. And the advantage of this view, which of course is admittedly quite heretical in comparison with the traditional church doctrine, the advantage of that view for him was also that he then could reconcile Christology with prophetology in Islam or in Judaism. Here you have, by the way, it may be interesting for you to see this, although the quote of Corbin was about the idea of the heavenly man within Islam. Sometimes that concept, that idea is also called al-insan al-kamil, the perfect man, the universal man, of which Muhammad within Islamic tradition is, of course, the primary manifestation on earth. But that idea of a heavenly man or a celestial anthropos is quite universal. Here you see two images where that idea is beautifully visualized. On the left, you see a classical miniature by the mystic Hildegard von Bingen, and we're talking about the 10th, 11th century. That's her visionary perception. This is really the result of her own imaginal experience. Here you see her presentation of the Trinity, with the human figure being the Son, the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, Christ, not as incarnated on earth, but as, again, an archetypal cosmic man, a heavenly man. And on the right, you see the traditional Kabbalistic representation of the heavenly man, very often called Adam Kadmon, and corresponding also with the famous Jewish tree of life. Just as an illustration that that idea that the unknowable Godhead, the absolute, manifests itself in a human celestial form is quite a universal perspective. So, to no surprise, probably, for all of us, Corbin had a lot of sympathy, evidently, with some early forms of Christianity, and specifically those early Jewish Christianity traditions that are often called Ebionite Christianity, to which I referred already when I was talking about the baptism. And why was he so enamored by it? Because he recognized in that form of Christianity a lot of similarities with the ideas in esoteric Islam, with esoteric prophetology in Islam. Some scholars, and I think he was himself one of them, do not hesitate in making clear that there is probably also a clear historical influence between that Jewish form of Christianity that became heretical and the origins of Islam. But there is much debate about that, how that connection can really be seen or not. Admittedly, if you only look at the Quran, there is that famous passage in the Quran where it's stated that the Jews did not succeed in killing Christ, that he was not crucified, that they were only taken in by an appearance of his death, and that God carried Jesus towards himself. That's almost a literal quote from the Quran I'm now giving to you. So there is already something docetic within the Quranic view on Jesus Christ. So for some scholars, that's one of the many illustrations that there could be a connection between Ebionite Christianity, for example, and some Islamic way of thinking about Christ. But that is a footnote. What does Corbin himself say about Ebionite Christianity? And that immediately explains why he has so much sympathy for it. He says, for Ebionite Christianity, sacred history is constituted by the successive manifestations, so not one only unique manifestation, of the celestial anthropos, of that celestial man, of the eternal Adam Christos, as he calls it also, who is the prophet of truth, the true prophet. Again, with the true prophet is not meant as that true prophet manifests himself in a concrete human being. No, the whole idea is exactly that the true prophet precedes manifestation on earth. And within the Ebionite tradition, there are 7, if you include Adam, 8. We count 7 of these manifestations, Corbin says, 8 if we include the terrestrial person of Adam himself. So the first prophet, the first human revelation of God was Adam himself. So you have Adam, Noah, Enoch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and Jesus. They are considered as successive manifestations of the celestial anthropos. And Corbin would stress these are 7 manifestations, not incarnations of the heavenly word, of the Logos, of the true prophet. So the fundamental basis of this prophetology is therefore the idea of the true prophet, who is a celestial anthropos, the Christus eternus, the eternal Christ, hastening from Christophany to Christophany. Yeah, sometimes Corbin is really pure poetry. So the eternal Christ, the Logos, which was the Christ that in the Acts of John was being experienced as that cross of light, that eternal Logos shows itself from Christophany to Christophanies, from a Christic manifestation after the other. And obviously it continues by saying that that way of thinking within Ebionite Christianity continues within Islam. So this is the same structure that Islamic prophetology presents, with this difference, obviously, that the succession of Christophanies, so of appearances of Christ, is no longer completed with the prophet Jesus of Nazareth, but with the prophet of Islam, the seal of the prophets, whose coming Jesus himself announced, a reference to the Paraclete, and who is the recapitulation of all the prophets according to the Islamic tradition. So how could we now sum more or less that whole idea of the mystery of the dual nature of Christ, human and divine? How could we sum that up in a way that we, as it were, transcend these different Christian denominations, heresies, theological formulations of the relationship between the divine and the human? In other words, could we find a metaphysical way to capture the essence of what we have stated until now, and which Corbin tried to formulate in his own way by being inspired by his studies in Islamic esotericism? And I think it's possible to do that metaphysically. Let's start with a very simple premise which we can find in all mystical traditions, in East and West, namely that there is a principial distinction to be made between what we could call the absolute, or the divine principle, or the absolute deity, no matter how you call it, the unknowable, the uncreated, and what is created, or the relative, the manifestation, the world, to which belongs, of course, also humanity, man. So there is a principial distinction between the absolute and the relative, or as they say in Hindu metaphysics, between Atma and Maya. But that triggers immediately, of course, an interesting question. The absolute and the relative could only be related somehow to each other, the uncreated and the created, the unmanifested and the manifested, if in one way or the other, the relative would already be present within the absolute, as it were, prefigured in the absolute, and the other way around, if the absolute would be capable of manifesting itself in the relative. Otherwise, it would not only be a distinction, but a complete separation, which would declare the relative as non-existent, or the opposite, would declare the absolute as non-existent, which is the same as pure materialism. So, in other words, if we really metaphysically want to honor a distinction between deity and creation, between absolute and relative, without mixing them, and without that the one disappears in the other, then the relative must already pre-exist in the absolute, and the absolute must be capable of showing itself in the relative. I hope that's clear. Otherwise, there could be no connection between the two. And it seems that all religious traditions try to find a way to, and especially in their esoteric dimensions, try to find a way to, for our topic, what does it mean when we contemplate more on that idea, that if the relative is already prefigured in the absolute, then the absolute in itself must have a relative dimension. In other words, it's not surprising that religious traditions, again, more in their mystical esoteric level than in their ordinary theology, make a distinction between the absolute in itself, or deity in itself, what a mystic like Meister Eckhart would call the Godhead more than God, or what in the Middle Ages was also called the Deus absconditus, the hidden God, of which one really can say nothing. There's not one way we can talk about the absolute in itself. It's beyond any qualification. It's supra-personal. You cannot have any attributes given to it. And in addition to that, or manifesting from the deity in itself, you have the revealed God. And that's God expressing itself as a person. Deus revelatus, not a hidden God, but the revealed God. That's the heavenly man, the true prophet, or what in some traditions is also called the uncreated logos. And we know what the word logos means, word. And that already says a lot, because just like a word manifests a hidden thought, so the Deus Revelatus, God as a person, God who can have a relationship with his creation, with the manifestation, reveals itself from the hidden deity. So within Christian metaphysics, Christian theology, the relationship between the Godhead and God is, of course, a relationship between God the Father and God the Son. So within the absolute, we have, as it were, the absolute in itself and the relative absolute, the revealed God. And that's that celestial anthropos. And the same, we can make a distinction within the relative. Within the relative, we have what we could say fallen, unregenerate man, man living in ignorance. Plato would say man living in the cage. The Buddha would say man living in complete oblivion about what is real and what is not. And we have man who is regenerated, saved, enlightened. Not that all these terms mean the same thing. What would be called in the monotheistic traditions, man as a prophet. And where man as a prophet becomes, as it were, the repository, the vehicle, the earthly manifestation of deity revelation, of the word, of the Logos, when these two come together, we have a divine manifestation in human nature. That would be then the Logos, both uncreated and created, coming together in man as a bridge between heaven and earth. And if we understand this, then you can see that this metaphysical framework does not say the mode, the modus operandi by which this happens. This could be docetic, this could be completely in accordance with the idea that the Logos, Christ, is one divine person taking human nature and having divine nature at the same time. This metaphysical approach does not necessarily favor a specific Christology, I would say. It also helps us to understand that when we hear statements, for example, the famous I am statements of Christ in the New Testament, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the door, I am the heavenly bread, I am the resurrection, etc., that who is speaking is, of course, the Logos, the uncreated Logos, as he manifests himself in regenerated man, in the created Logos. There is also that famous hadith, one of my favorite hadiths, where Muhammad says, I was a prophet when Adam was between water and clay. I hope you would agree with me that this statement can hardly be attributed to the mere biological, so to speak, manifestation of Muhammad, who could only exist a few earthly years. What's speaking here is what is called by some Sufis the Mohammedan reality that precedes even creation. Well, that's not far removed from the idea of the uncreated Logos or the idea of the true prophet or the heavenly man. And it clearly resembles when Christ says, I am before even Abraham was, a famous statement of Christ in the Gospel of John. So I hope that this clarifies a bit what we have been calling the mystery of the two natures of Christ. Because metaphysically, that's really the mystery of how the absolute and the relative can be related in man as the Logos manifested. If we would now ask ourselves how docetic is Corbin's Christology, because his sympathy for Ebionite Christianity seems to go in that direction, although Ebionite Christianity is not by definition the most docetic form of Christianity in history. How docetic is Corbin's Christology? He tries to convince us that Docetism is maybe not understood as well as it should be understood. There is a kind of bias towards Docetism. Let's quote him again. We are in the habit of ridiculing Docetism, which it seems to us has reduced the reality of Jesus, the man, to a mere phantasm, when in truth, this Docetism is a strictly theological critique of knowledge of the law governing apparition of religious phenomena to religious consciousness and governing the reciprocity of the soul and its revealed God. Now, that's, I think, a complicated sentence, so maybe we can unpack it a little bit. What is he saying here? I think what he tries to say is the rather simplistic view on Docetism is to reduce that idea to the thought that the human nature of Jesus was really not real, and that his earthly manifestation was in that sense illusory, a mere phantasm, as he says. Now, according to Corbin, he says Docetism is more complicated than that. That's why we have such a huge variety of it. Not only within early Christianity, but also in Buddhism, we have docetic visions, docetic ideas. In Islam is mentioned. So he says, such a simplistic view of Docetism that can be summarized as calling the human manifestation of Jesus a mere illusion, and hence also his crucifixion and his suffering on the cross a mere illusion, doesn't give full right to the complexity of the idea. What lies at the root of the idea is, as the word Docetism itself seems to suggest, dokeo, appear, is that we cannot deny pure phenomenologically, experientially, that there are different ways of what we could call Christic experiences, experiences of people, of Christ, of the Logos, the eternal Christ, manifesting himself in different forms in the visionary experiences of disciples, believers, and mystics throughout the ages. Just like within Islamic mystical tradition, you see an analog phenomenon of, for example, manifestations of saints, imams, prophets in the soul, the heart of the believers. So Docetism is more about acknowledging the reality of appearances than calling the so-called physical appearance of Christ an illusion. Corbin would probably say that Docetism is more about giving spiritual realism its value, and by giving reality to visionary experiences than by calling unreal historical physical manifestations. And that's an interesting opening up of the term Docetism. Whether everyone would agree with that, that's something else, especially the church fathers would probably frown their eyebrows. But he makes an important point here, I think, which invites clearer investigation. So that means that Christ is a real apparition, which is proportionate to the theophanic dimension of the soul, that is, its aptitude for being shown a divine figure. Now, when I will conclude my lecture, I will come back to that with the question whether this view then is really necessarily in opposition with an historical incarnation. Personally, I'm not fully convinced. What I do find important here is that Corbin stresses that the Christic experiences, as depicted in the Acts of John, for example, or in the Acts of Peter, should not be called illusory only because they belong not to the historical physical time frame. And the other way around, an historical physical manifestation should not be simply called a phantasm. So for him, Docetism is not so much a set doctrine, but a way of thinking, a tendency of looking not only at the mystery of Christ, but really a way of looking to the whole of reality. Thus, according to him, it can be reconciled with formulations that literally contradict one another. So that means for him, okay, we can have a theological formulation which has become heretical, like monophysitism. Christ is only divine and hardly has a human nature, and one extreme. And then we can have the official church doctrine that Christ is one divine person having a divine and human nature. Then we can have other views on the dual nature of Christ. For Corbin, he firmly believed that Docetism would enable, as a kind of way of thinking and not a set doctrine, would enable to cater all these different seemingly contradicting formulations. Whether that's really the case remains to be seen. But I hope I could convince you by now that Corbin's Docetism is more complex, more dynamic, more visionary than the Docetism that is so vehemently attacked by the Church Fathers in the beginning of Christianity. Let's now continue by showing how the idea of the Logos manifesting itself in different forms, the idea of the Christus Eternus, shows itself in different visionary experiences. Let us now explore again by going to some root texts how that shows itself, how we can have a closer look at that. And we will have to go back then, of course, also later on to the Acts of John, to the Cross of Light. But before that, I want to go back to the Acts of Peter. I quoted from the Acts of Peter when he was describing his own experience of the Transfiguration, as you remember. And in the same document, he also bears witness of another event that perfectly fits in what we are now talking about and what Corbin found of great importance. We will now enter a scene where the apostles, under the leadership of Peter, are grouped together with some other disciples, including a group of women described as widows, and they are in a room, and suddenly they all witness the manifestation of Christ. And it's interesting how that's described. So we can read in the Acts of Peter, and when all had prayed, the hall, the room wherein they were shown as when it lightened, even with such a light as cometh in the clouds, yet not such a light as that of the daytime, but unspeakable, invisible. And as we lay there, only those widows stood up, which were blind, and the bright light which appeared unto us entered into their eyes and made them to see. And they said, we saw an old man of such comeliness as we are not able to declare to thee. But others said, we saw a young man. And others still said, we saw a boy touching our eyes delicately, and so were our eyes opened. And Peter comments, how that they beheld the Lord in diverse forms, for every one of us, according as he could contain the sight, saw as he was able. So clearly, this is again a theophanic manifestation of Christ in the visionary experience of some people present in that hall. And an interesting detail is, and that's probably also meant symbolically, that those who are most capable of being receptive for Christ, showing himself in different forms, as an old man, as a young man, as a boy, are widows who are physically blind. So That's maybe important, that detail. It's exactly because they were, as it were, blind to the physical world, and whether that is meant literally is debatable, that they could be more receptive for their Christophanic experience they are here describing. And of course, that final sentence of Peter, we already have seen that several times. The visionary experience is in accordance to the capacity of the perceiver. And that's also what Corbin says when he comments on that passage. He says, we are dealing here with visions, theophanic visions. There is an actual perception of an object, of a concrete person, and the figure and the features are sharply defined. This person presents all the appearances of a sensuous object, and yet it is not given to the perception of the sense organ. So it has all the characteristics at first sight of a sensuous object, of something or someone which we would see in a sensible world, but it's not given to the perception of the sense organs. It's given to what we would say the eye of the heart, the sense organ that is necessary for being receptive and cognitive of the imaginal world. This perception is essentially an event of the soul, taking place in the soul and for the soul. As such, its reality is essentially individuated, personal, for and with each soul. And the field of its vision, its horizon, is in every case defined by the capacity, the dimension of its own being. As it's stated in the Latin text of the Acts of Peter, talem eum vidi qualem capere potimi. So everyone sees in accordance with his or her own capacity to see. If we now go back to where we started, the Acts of John, the Cross of Light, we, I think, can now much better approach the mystery that John tried to describe in this beautiful text. So what did he describe again? He said, after that he fled from the physical crucifixion to the Mount of Olives, the Logos showed me a cross of light set up, and around the cross a great multitude which had no one form, and in the cross was one form and one likeness. So there's clearly a distinction to be made, we could say, between those who are capable of participating in their visionary experience, like John himself in the Acts, to the cross of light, who are part of the cross of light, and those who are still separated from the cross of light, who surround the cross of light. The multitude without has not a clear structure or form. It's chaotic, while those who are in the cross of light are together one form and one likeness. It's what's called in traditional Christianity the mystical body of Christ. Every believer, every disciple of Christ becomes part of the body of Christ, which is here being presented as a cross of light. And this cross of light is sometimes called the word, the Logos. So here we see the cross of light is an imagination of the uncreated Logos. And it's only called that way, very interesting, by me, he says, for your sake, because otherwise you would not understand it. And sometimes it's called mind, Jesus, Christ, door, way, bread, seed, resurrection. Sometimes called Son, Father, Spirit, life, truth, faith, grace. So that cross of light has many names. And it is as if each name is a divine entrance to the mystery. So Jesus is the physical man Jesus. It's not separate from the cross of light. It's a way of entering the cross of light. So is Christ. So is the meaning of the word door, bread. Very, very beautifully passage. And this is, of course, not the cross of wood, which you will see when you go down here. So the existence of the cross of wood and the man suffering there is not denied. It's not also declared a mere illusion. But what you're now seeing, John, is what is behind that cross of wood, behind the physical man suffering, which is the Logos himself. This then is the cross which has united all things by the word and marked off things transient and inferior and then compacted all into one. So beyond any doubt, this is a cross that belongs primarily to the world of the spirit and shows itself in the world of the soul as a cross of light. And it has a clear metaphysical meaning. It's that which marks off the higher and the lower, and the horizontal bar makes a distinction between the heavens and the earth, or the waters above and the waters below in Genesis, for example. But it also connects it, the vertical axis. And a physical cross can only be a physical representation of this metaphysical cross, which is present beyond time and space, connects everything, but also distinguishes everything. It's the cross that is responsible for a cosmos in the first place, so that there is not only chaos, but cosmos, which also means order, also means beauty, beautiful ordering. So the cross of light, we can say that this vision that St. John experiences is really the primary crucifixion he's watching. Not the crucifixion of flesh and blood, but the crucifixion of light. A divine kenosis, emptying, which is fundamental for the creation of the cosmos. It's as if the absolute Godhead has to express itself as a word in order for the cosmos to exist. And if we would imagine such a divine cross and crucifixion of the Godhead, then it would be better to visualize that in 6 directions, so 3-dimensional. And it's interesting to note that in some early scriptures, that metaphysical crucifixion is indeed described that way. In the Clementine homilies, for example, we read a passage, "There proceeds from God the heart of the cosmos, indefinite extension, upwards and downwards, to the right and left, backward and forward." So 6 directions. Looking in these 6 directions as at a constant number, he completes the creation of the cosmos, of which he is the beginning and the end. And with he is meant the Logos again, the uncreated Logos, the Christus Eternus, the heavenly man. So we could say, when John witnesses the cross of light, he also participates to a primordial crucifixion, of which an earthly crucifixion is a symbolical representation. Accidentally, here you see a very traditional, classical Christian symbol of these 6 directions cross, including the Alpha and the Omega. And the cross of light is still speaking, or at least the Logos is still speaking while he's showing his metaphysical cross of light to John. He says, "To see me as I really am is not possible, but only what they are able to recognize. You hear that I suffered, yet I suffered not. That I suffered not, yet I did suffer. You hear that I was pierced, yet was I not wounded, hanged, and I was not hanged, that blood flowed from me, yet it did not flow. And in a word, those things that they do not say, those I suffered." Incredibly beautiful. But what he's trying to convey to John is, do you see the mystery of my dual nature? They say that I suffered on the cross, but on the same time, I did not suffer as that cross of light. But it's also not that simple to think that I didn't suffer. I also suffered as the cross of light, because that cross of light is an eternal crucifixion, an eternal sacrifice of the Godhead. So the statement, I suffered and I did not suffer, it can be attributed both to the man hanging on the cross, as it were, and to the cross of light, because they both suffered and they did not suffer. The physical suffering is not part of the cross of light, and the divine suffering is not part of the physical crucifixion. But they are both symbolizing each other. In that sense, they're, as it were, coherent and relate to each other. In that sense, one could say there is even only one crucifixion happening on several levels, and hence also different forms of suffering and resurrection happening on different levels. Now, what their real sufferings are, so from the perspective of the Logos, of the cross of light, now what they are, I will reveal to you, for I know you will understand. At least someone will understand. John will understand. Perceive in me the slaying of the Logos, the piercing of the Logos, the blood of the Logos, the wounding of the Logos, the hanging of the Logos, the passion of the Logos, the nailing of the Logos, and the death of the Logos. So you see, what John is privileged to witness is indeed the crucifixion of the divine word. And that is not an event that only happens one moment in time via the physical crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. No, this is an eternal event that can be symbolized and can be find its presentation on earth with the death and subsequent resurrection of Jesus, but is not limited to it. Or otherwise put, the real deeper meaning of the physical crucifixion and later on the resurrection lies exactly in the vision of what John is here experiencing. Therefore, Christ says to John, in the first place, so primarily think of the Logos, then you shall perceive the Lord, and thirdly the man and what he has suffered. Remember that sentence, because I come back to that in the end of my lecture. So, if we now see that the mystery of Christianity, which is a mystery of the identity of Christ and the dual nature, his divine and human nature, has led to different Christologies, next to the well-known and dominant one, which we find in traditional church doctrine, some conflicting ones, and also the one embraced by Henri Corbin. Are they necessarily competing, conflicting Christologies, or is there a possibility that they can complement each other maybe? I would like to put this as a question for all of us, including myself, that I don't give the impression that I can fully answer this question, but I think it's a fair one to be asked. I think if we ask ourselves, can we reconcile the conflicting views on the Christian mystery? We should, of course, respect differences where they are. There are some views that have been called heretical that are clearly in no way ever reconcilable with official church doctrine. And the endeavor to reconcile what is irreconcilable is, of course, futile. And we should also not be seduced in trying to reconcile things in name of a kind of political or spiritual correctness, if that's impossible. But on the other hand, we should be sensitive, I think, to the idea that we should not immediately embrace one view above the other automatically, simply because we have a liking or a disliking for it. In other words, we should resist temptation to either immediately deny the value of exoteric church doctrine in favor of more esoteric alternative Gnostic doctrines, or vice versa. And to be more concrete, it's of course well known that in alternative spiritual circles, and I don't think that within the Theosophical Society that's different, there is almost an innate dislike, but also an innate ignorance, admittedly, about the official church doctrine regarding Christ and the incarnation and the crucifixion. So I think it would be fair if all of the people who are genuinely interested in this question take a more open approach and not immediately embrace one in favor of the other. If we don't start from that premise, I think it's completely impossible to even think about this question, let alone try to answer it. And I don't think it honors the mystery. It would reduce the mystery into a pure theological problem. We would also have to ask ourselves why a literal incarnation would be by definition problematic. It seems to be the case for Corbin. Now, I may be a big fan of Corbin, but it doesn't mean I'm uncritical or that I don't have genuine questions about some things he says and writes. What seems to be problematic for Corbin about the literal incarnation of Christ is that it could lead, and it has led undeniably, to an historical reduction of the mystery of Christ, at the cost of Christ as primarily an imaginal reality, and with that is not meant imaginary, but as a symbolical reality, as a reality on the level of the soul, on the level of how the Logos shows himself to human beings. And that, I think, is an honest critique that Corbin wants to give. The literal incarnation is, in that sense, indeed problematic, because it reduces the possibility of the divine to manifest itself to a pure historical event. But having said that, I personally think that an historical literal incarnation is not, by definition, in opposition to a more visionary way of looking at the mystery of Christ, if we can agree upon that the latter is that which really gives meaning and depth to the historical representation and event. I think the problem may raise the other way around. If we start from the historical and restrict it to it, then indeed Corbin has an important point to make. But if we look at the historical, not as by definition unimportant, let alone unreal, but as a symbolical representation of an eternal event, of which we have seen a beautiful description in the Acts of John, then personally I see less problems with a literal incarnation view. Because the problem lies not in the view of incarnation itself, but in reducing the divine manifestation to that. In other words, the problem seems to lie that we would be inclined to think that a literal incarnation excludes a continuing theophanic revelation of the Logos. And personally, I would say, why would that be the case? That it worked that way, that's something different, but I don't think it's necessary. And one may also ask whether alternative doctrines are by definition better to approach the mystery. For example, are these docetic views, which a lot of people seem to favor, denying the incarnation in itself without any danger? I don't think so. I think we should be careful there, because some of these docetic views, not necessarily the one which is more complex as defended by Corbin himself, but there was a reason why the church fathers found these docetic views problematic. And one of the major reasons was that it completely disqualifies history. It makes it completely unimportant what happens in history if the physical incarnation and human nature is only a phantasm or an illusion. In other words, it robs the manifestation of the Logos of Christ of its physical embodiment. Not surprisingly, some of these docetic views then also have a kind of negative view towards the world and reality, which could lead to a kind of escapism and illusionism of the world. I think if we look at the most extreme Gnostic traditions, which seem to be popular in some circles, we should not neglect that these views have a very negative view on physical reality, on the world and the body. And personally, I do understand that the church fathers were very worried about a Christology that would declare the world as evil and the body as evil. And the fact that the Logos became flesh, as it's stated in the beginning of the Gospel of St. John, was for the church fathers exactly the whole point. Namely, that by becoming a physical embodiment, the Logos, as it were, made matter sacred, made the body's transfiguration possible, and made therefore also the deification of human nature possible. And I think that's something very intuitively attractive still in traditional church doctrine, which I think the docetic view is lacking. So we could ask ourselves whether we really always understand that idea of incarnation on the one hand, defended by traditional church doctrine, and Docetism, which is opposite to it, on the other hand. Maybe we don't always understand that. For example, if it's stated the Word became flesh, maybe we too quickly have understood this also in official church doctrine as the Word became matter. But is flesh the same as matter? I don't think so. Matter is an abstraction. Matter is an intellectual concept. Matter is something public, objectifiable. Whether flesh, if it's stated the Word became flesh, that opens much more vistas, I would say. Why would that flesh be restricted to physical flesh? Why couldn't it also show itself in visionary flesh? So in a kind of spiritual realism instead of only a physical realism. I think the word flesh is also much more personal, definitely alive. So the Word became flesh really makes clear the Word took human nature. With flesh is not meant a piece of meat, if you catch my drift. And with Docetism, on the other hand, is not necessarily meant, as Corbin tried to explain, mere illusion, mere phantasm. So these are just some concerns and questions I asked myself when I was preparing for this lecture. And I hope you don't mind that I don't have any clear-cut answers to all these questions. But I think they are important if we really want to give the mystery its rightful place to contemplate upon. And in that context, I think it's wise to not forget that in the history of the Christian tradition, most Christian esotericists and theosophers indeed do not deny the physical incarnation of Christ. In other words, it would be quite mistaken to think that in 2000 years of Christianity, the more mystically inclined Christians and also the more theosophically inclined Christians, influenced by Jacob Böhme, for example. So Christian esotericists in general, it would be a big mistake to think that they have Gnostic inclinations in the sense that they are sharing that very dualistic worldview that some Gnostic schools had in the beginning of Christianity, with that negative view towards the world, towards the body, and corresponding a docetic view on the human nature of Christ. Not at all. I just show you those three here: Swedenborg, Franz von Baader, who was a great Catholic philosopher and theologian in the 19th century and very much influenced by Jacob Böhme. So he was one of the greatest Christian theosophers in the 19th century. And Vladimir Solovyov, also influenced to a certain extent by that Böhmian way of thinking, and of course firmly rooted within the Russian Orthodox tradition. Neither of these admittedly Christian esotericists deny the incarnation or the importance of the incarnation. And in that sense, I think it's important to keep that in mind. I'll give you a quote, for example, of Vladimir Solovyov from his lectures on divine humanity. And then you see a view that is indeed almost completely opposite to the one of Corbin. Although I think on other topics, they would firmly agree with each other. In his 11th lecture, Solovyov says, in the sphere of eternal divine being, Christ is the eternal spiritual center of the universal organism, so of the whole universe. So Christ is the Logos. So here he sees Christ as the center of creation. This organism, which includes universal mankind, falling into the stream of phenomena, became subject to the law of external being, and by labor and suffering had to restore in time that which it lost in eternity, its inner unity with God and nature. So all physical creation, as it were, fell from its Christic center and became part of time. So that means for Solovyov, Christ too, as the active principle of this unity, must, for its real restoration, descend into the same stream of phenomena, must subject himself to the same law of external being, and from the center of eternity become the center of history, appearing at a specific moment of history in the fullness of time. So in other words, for someone like Vladimir Solovyov, but Swedenborg and Franz von Baader would agree with that. Christ, the Logos, the true prophet, the heavenly man, the way how the Godhead reveals himself, would almost be limited if he would not be capable of manifesting itself in the stream of time, and the stream of time would not be able to participate to the eternal if the eternal would not be born in time. Now, the big disagreement between, I think, Solovyov and Corbin would probably be that Corbin would say, yes, but the manifestation in time is not necessarily via a physical incarnation, while Solovyov seems to stress the importance of that. So all the three of them, they're only representatives of Christian esotericism throughout the ages, would have no problem with the classical patristic statement, which you can find with St. Ignatius, with St. Athanasius, Irenaeus, Clemens from Alexandria. All the church fathers say more or less the same thing, that the word of God became man so that man may learn to become God. And I think it's important to remember that Christian esotericism is not necessarily in opposition with the incarnation view. So how could we maybe connect the dots? Well, maybe we can use an approach which is hermetic, namely that the above and the below correspond with each other, that the eternal spiritual corresponds with temporary via the world of the soul, and that since everything that is manifested on our plane of existence symbolizes with the world above, why would then, a simple question I would ask myself, an historical incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection not symbolize with, correspond with eternal events in the world of the soul and universal patterns in the world of the spirit? Like this image seems to suggest, we see a physical cross with physical people, but above that, we see that metaphysical cross with the 6 directions. And my question is very simple. Why would the one negate the other? Why would they not be related exactly with each other? The Gospel of Philip seems to suggest that when it says, it was not only when he appeared on earth, that Jesus appeared on earth, that he voluntarily laid down his life, but he voluntarily laid down his life from the very day the world came into being. So here, again, the same idea which I tried to convey, that the physical laying of the life of Jesus is in exact correspondence with an eternal emptying, laying down the life of the Logos. And one does not deny the other or exclude the other. And maybe that's then the deeper meaning of that final sentence in the Acts of John. Therefore, in the first place, think of the Logos. Think in the first place of the Logos and his crucifixion. Then you shall perceive the Lord, and thirdly, the man and what he has suffered. In other words, if we would look at the crucifixion on 3 levels, because that's what the text seems to suggest, then we have a crucifixion on the level of the spirit, so on the level of eternal ideas, a crucifixion in the imaginary world, and a crucifixion that could take place in the historical world. And the thesis I want to present is that they are in correspondence with each other. And maybe that's less putting these different Christologies in juxtaposition. Maybe this could be a way of looking at the different Christologies in a more harmonized way, where the cross within time and space, the cross of man, which should not only be restricted to the crucifixion of Jesus, but to any crucifixion, as it were, happening on earth by someone who is following a religious path. And a lot of mystics have experienced their own crucifixion, as it were, and resurrection. That event isn't clearly in correspondence with the crucifixion on the level of the soul and the crucifixion on the level of the spirit. I think there is no better way to conclude and to respect the mystery by giving a final quote by Dionysius the Areopagite. And with that, I would like to conclude the whole lecture. He says, by the love of Christ for us, the superessential gave up its mystery and manifested himself by assuming humanity. However, in spite of this manifestation, or rather to use a more divine language at the very heart of it, he loses nothing of his mysteriousness. For the mystery of Jesus remained hidden. No reason and no intelligence have fathomed his essential nature. Thank you for your patience and for your attention. And we probably see each other the next lecture.